So good morning. Thank you all for attending, and hats off not only to the Center for American Studies, NDTA, APA, but really the whole collection here of the attendees. When I looked at the list of the attendees, I was impressed by the breadth of the attendance. And I've done a couple of these strategic report workshops and that over the years. I told Admiral Brown when he called me about putting this event together, and I said, "Don't worry, you're not stepping on my toes." I could not do this and what was done in bringing this forum together and in this location for us. So hats off to the group for doing that and having really the whole enterprise here for this, because this is far larger than what we've had in the past for our strategic port workshops, which have been primarily just with the government agencies and the ports themselves. So good morning. For those that don't know me, as Admiral Brown said, I'm the Associate Administrator, Kevin Tokarski, Associate Administrator for Strategic Sealift in the Department of Transportation and Maritime Administration. I'm not the ports guy, but what I do is I help to bridge, and that from our military readiness and the reliance on our sealift industries at large to enable total force movement. And so my organization has responsibilities in that, from that connector piece, and working with our port gateways, working with our whole agency and the tools that we have to enable the gateway transition for our ports. I also chair the National Port Readiness Network, and some of you may not know what that is. It is a group of 9 federal agencies, and as Admiral Busby mentioned them by name, the United States Transportation Command, the Military Surface Deployment Distribution Command, Military Sealift Command, United States Coast Guard, Transportation Security Agency, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, U.S. Forces Command, and U.S. NORTHCOM. That is the 9 federal agency bodies that it takes to help manage and coordinate our activities across our strategic port front. And that relationship is defined in a memorandum of understanding of how we work and coordinate our activities. So I've been asked to moderate this panel discussion on the role of strategic ports, and I'll be asking each of our distinguished panelists to discuss the current trends and issues from the U.S. government and a DoD perspective, and also from the strategic port perspective. And specifically, what is expected of the strategic ports? What role are they expected to play in the deployment of U.S. military forces, and how that role will change in the future? What can strategic ports do better? And how can our strategic ports be better prepared for future operations? And then there's one question that I said that's missing out of those 3. And that question is, what do we need to do better to enable our strategic ports to survive, if you will, not only to be able to survive through the push of a military deployment, an extended deployment, but more importantly, and survive in an economically viable manner, and as we advance the nation's economy, because our nation's economy hinges on trade and commerce through those ports by far. So I have 3 distinguished panelists here to help me discuss these issues, and I'd like to introduce, I'll do it and then they'll speak in turn, Rear Admiral Pete Clarke from the U.S. Transportation Command, better known as TRANSCOM, where he serves as the Director of Strategic Plans, Policies, and Logistics, J54. A career submarine officer with command experience of the SSBN Rhode Island. Also a UVA grad, so congratulations on that March Madness win.
Still celebrating.
Still celebrating. I bet you are. You get a full year for that. Next we have Colonel Lillard Evans, the Deputy Commander of the U.S. Army Military Surface Deployment Distribution Command, better known as SDDC. South Carolina native, commissioned from South Carolina State University, a combat warrior with extensive command and field assignments in transportation and sustainment. And last but not least, I'd like to introduce Chris Fisher. Chris is the Port Director and Chief Executive Officer for the Port of Beaumont in Beaumont, Texas. Chris joined the port in 1981, is responsible for the day-to-day operations of the port. His bio said it's the 5th largest in terms of tonnage and 3rd fastest growing, so I'll believe it, Chris. That's good. There may be you might have some competition out here on that, but go at it. And also a local Lamar University graduate. I know Beaumont very well. I spent a lot of time down there as I have a large sealift fleet down there, and that's where we've made our major investment in terms of our our Sealift force capabilities in the port of Beaumont. So before they begin, I'm going to give you some of my comments regarding MARAD's look regarding ports. And when I think of this port network, it is a complex system, undoubtedly. When we look at the government agencies that are involved, stretching across multiple departments, it's not even just between two, it's actually across several. We have transportation providers and a real mix of transportation providers, right, that touch our ports. So whether it's ammo carriers, truckers, rail, and then the ships themselves and our Visa and MSP carriers that call at those ports, and then mix in government-operated ships in that as well. Military requirements balanced with economic requirements of the port. And the Maritime Administration maybe is in an odd spot for the role as chairing this port committee, but I would tell you, I think it's because of our uniqueness in a sense of really being that balance between the national security requirements of our transportation systems and networks. So from big DOT's perspective, all of that, and a balancing and supporting our military national security requirements in that as well. So DOT clearly has a very strong national security role and mission. It's the Secretary of Transportation charged under the Defense Production Act with the management of all civil transportation resources to enable and support the national security of the nation. So it's a very important role that the department has, and a burden as well, and the responsibilities for that. We also look at the ports in terms of that need to be backed by the proper infrastructure and the infrastructure investments, and Admiral Busby mentioned grants and that have been supporting that as well. Resilience and cyber preparedness for our ports, key challenges for us. The last couple of port workshops that we've held, actually the themes were readiness to support the warfighter and back to basics. And you heard both of those themes already mentioned today. And so they are fundamental aspects in terms of what we are doing in preparedness for that resilience, the infrastructure, and our ability to support the warfighter. So we work to stress all the parts of the systems, understanding what we will do and how we will do it. That's an important aspect. A port or a service committee workshop that we had about a year ago, one of the ports brought out and said, I really want to see what it is you are going to do and how you're going to do that. What does the document look like? What are the contracts that are going to be in place? How does the Department of Transportation actually give a priority order? And what does that mean? So that a port takes a document from the federal government and says, this has priority over all contracts that that labor berth operator or that facility operator is going to have to put aside to ensure the movement of military cargo. People need to understand this in detail, and so we are getting into the detail. And our organization at the federal level and at the port community level are working on that and refining that. So we actually not only just think what we're going to do, we actually know how we're going to do it, and we can actually test it and exercise it. And that, I think, is very important, and one of the things that will undoubtedly be some lessons learned from this workshop. And I'm not sure if I have a slide or not, but if I don't, that's okay. And what we're going to do, I'm going to hold up, and in the breakout room where we had the coffee earlier today, there's a couple of trifolds that we've got sitting there, a little bit on the background on the strategic ports, and that including a little maplet of showing you the 17 commercial strategic seaports. So if you're unfamiliar with that, please pick them up. We've got a brochure on the portal for the National Port Readiness Network, and then a little primer on what this thing is in terms of this network. So from our perspective, MARAD has some of the important trends that affect strategic ports I'd like to highlight quickly are that we are in this transition mode right now for putting our DOT regulations together under the Transportation Priority Allocation System of the Department, TPAS. And TPAS is the instrumental element system that the Department of Transportation will manage at large the transportation requirements for the Department of Defense, and how the allocation of the resources and giving the priority rating order would be applied across those networks. We've also revised what was called the Port Planning Order into a Port Planning Template, which contains the military port requirements for ship berthing, staging, road and rail access during military activation, and then the eventual ship loading. And I'll note that they're are no substantial changes to the revision, but it is a new document. It's been reformatted and reorganized, hopefully to make it clearer. I say that. I'd like to and appreciate comments from the ports on that template and the feedback from that. We do have made planned changes to the Federal Port Controller Agreement and the National Shipping Authority regulations to make them more consistent with the Transportation Priority and Allocation System. And with respect to security clearances, MARAD is aggressively pursuing clearances for our strategic ports to ensure that at least 2 individuals at the ports are cleared to receive classified material. And along with that goes a secure telephone equipment unit, a STE, a classified phone, so that the ports are able to communicate with their, principally with their SDDC components and battalions and that, to be able to do planning and that, and have effective communication and classified communication. What's expected of the ports, certainly accurate and timely readiness reporting is important. Port plans and quarterly readiness reports keep the Maritime Administration and DoD abreast of the changes that may affect the ability of our armed forces to deploy in a timely fashion through those ports. And these important communications also allow strategic ports to offer alternatives which can improve military loadouts and adjust for changes as the port changes, whether it's new construction or development work. It allows them to offer in alternative solutions to be able to meet the military requirements for that port plan. What can they do better? Ports can coordinate with the U.S. Coast Guard and other members to ensure the Port Readiness Committee meetings, which the Coast Guard chairs. The annual readiness assessments and exercises are conducted. Attendance at the Port Readiness Committees is critical to ensuring that issues that affect the various aspects of military loadouts are looked at. I appreciate General Farman's comments yesterday and his own personal commitment in sitting in on a PRC meeting and that as well. And that's critical that from the federal agency side of it, that we are all in with the ports from that standpoint of the readiness. Sharing lessons learned and that for better visibility and distribution across the National Port Readiness Network in our working groups. And lastly, ports can jointly develop actionable recommendations for program and process improvements to the NPRN and the policymakers for us. And so we are ears open for that. How should the ports prepare for future operations? Exercises, tabletop exercises, all the BCT deployments, those are excellent tools for this as well. Better coordination between the NPRN members and the participants obviously go a long way to improving the processes and the improved communications, and this event goes a long way to helping with that. Improving cybersecurity in accordance with voluntary regulations. We've had some discussions yesterday regarding is the NIST standards, is that enough? Is that as a floor, or is there a level above that we need to be looking at from a cyber preparedness aspect? And then the last one, the fair question I think to ask back to us is, what should the various federal agencies do to better prepare and support strategic ports in peacetime and crisis? And especially if there's not sufficient funding. Everyone always asks, well, we need money for this. Well, how do we do this if there isn't funding available to be able to support that from that standpoint? So with that, a MARAD perspective, and now I'd like to turn to Admiral Clarke for the U.S. Transportation Command. Sir.
Thank you, Kevin. And let me add my thank you to NDTA, Christopher Newport University, MARAD, and SDDC for bringing together this group and for joining what have been up to now 2 disparate entities that were both focused on the same objective. So we're unsiloing the conversations. I think it has the potential to be a great event. The program itself is very nicely crafted to take us from both inside this panel, from strategic to operational to tactical level considerations, and then the panels, how they build on each other, allow us to carry out that same type of growth in our discussions. So please tie all those things together as we generate what hopefully is discussions instead of just us talking here from the podium. What I intended to do with my opening remarks was simply give you a strategic scene setter from TRANSCOM's perspective. Hopefully you were paying attention and realized that General Farman and Administrator Busby already did a much better job of painting the strategic scene setter than I possibly could. So I'm going to focus my brief comments on just the mission of TRANSCOM, but I thought I would put this slide up because this is what we're talking about, right? We're talking about our strategic ports and our power projection platforms and how they're all tied together. And I'm not to insult anybody's intelligence, but I don't want to assume that everybody understands and knows what every strategic port is, what the alternate ports are, where our power projection platforms, the Army basis primarily from which those forces are going to flow to the ports, where they are, and what is the agility and flexibility that we need, what we're working towards in our in shaping our strategic environment to be able to execute the missions should we have to. So I'll leave that as background. I'm not going to necessarily talk about it. But I'll talk about the TRANSCOM mission. It's to conduct globally integrated mobile operations in order to project and sustain the joint force. If you listen to that, it's inextricably linked to our nation's strategic ports. Our ability to deliver combat power to the right place at the right time and in the necessary scale to be lethal and decisive is critical to our national security. To ensure we can do this effectively, we must create the necessary conditions to credibly operate under adverse conditions and seamlessly transition to all levels of mobilization. We have to leverage what we refer to as the Joint Deployment and Distribution Enterprise, the end-to-end network, to enable global, flexible, and dynamic operations capable of supporting both commercial mobility and military forces through these interlocking series of nodes, modes, routes, and the partnerships that bring them all together. The strategic environment in which we will do this, in which we will conduct future operations, has definitely changed. That's the other message that I want to get across. It's not business as usual. The National Defense Strategy makes it clear that this is a different operating environment. We're in a period of great power competition in which China and Russia primarily look to counter the United States' global leadership position and are actively working to degrade our cohesion with allies and partners. For years, our adversaries have observed the U.S. as we deploy with impunity throughout the world. As we build this mound of iron on the continental United States, we move it to where we want to move it on our timeline without any disruptions. We're now in an environment where every facet of those military operations, starting with the deployment of combat power in the continental United States or wherever it's going to come from, will be contested. We should expect that the adversary actions will start in the cyber domain, and that's why collectively I think we're all hyper-focused on cyber defense and cyber protection and the ability to operate in a cyber-degraded or even cyber-denied environment. They'll start that long before any kinetic shots are fired. As a matter of fact, those actions are already taking place today. We have to recognize that. As such, the homeland is no longer a sanctuary. Adversaries continue to hold at risk the nation's long lines of communication, affecting our ability to present and sustain the forces at the right time and the right place. TRANSCOM must maintain its ability to operate at home and to sharpen its ability to deploy the forces into and within the contested battle space across that entire joint deployment distribution enterprise network. Our nation's strategic ports are critical nodes in this vital network. The requirements for volume and throughput of the combat forces called for in our operational plans for major contingencies, and that volume that's going to show up to those strategic ports is staggering. I don't expect you guys to study this slide, but what I wanted to give you was a little bit of a pictorial. If you look at, and I'll walk you through this slide in case you can't read it, but if you look at the top two quadrants, the very beginning of those slides, there's a sliver of capability built up. That's kind of steady state. And then look at what it builds up to, both in the square footage and then the throughput that's required. So let me walk you through the starting bottom right. You have what's going to be flowing into the ports from trucking and then railroad, and then what's building up at the ports is on the left-hand side, and then on the right-hand upper side is what's showing up in the forward area of operations. That is an incredible amount of combat power that has to go through our strategic ports in a timely manner in order to achieve our strategic objectives. We haven't seen it, even though we talk about the massive operations that we conducted during Desert Storm 1 and 2, and back to the reforger exercises. This is a different level of magnitude, and it's going to happen in a contested environment. And if we can't get that level of forces through the ports in the time that our operational plans call for, we will put at risk our ability to execute our mission objectives. I'll leave it at that right now, and we'll save the rest for any questions you may have. Over to you.
Colonel Lillard Evans here, DCO at SDDC. My job here is to give you somewhat of an operational perspective on sort of what we do in the roles of strategic ports. And then I'm going to pull on a few of the threads that Major General Farman talked about in his opening a little bit earlier. But first I want to thank NDTA, CNU, AAP, and MARAD for hosting this event and bringing the community together to have this very important conversation about strategic ports. My role in SDDC. I'm responsible for global operations in SDDC. So I work directly for General Farman, and he gives me guidance every day, along with a few others that's out here in the audience. And in SDDC, I like to frame it in two different ways. First, just look at our name. Our name says Military Surface Deployment and Distribution Command. So we're responsible for two things. We're responsible for moving the armed forces, and we're responsible for sustaining the armed forces. And as General Farman said, our mission clearly states, move, deploy, and sustain the armed forces to deliver readiness and lethality at speed. And that at speed becomes very important as we talk about our strategic ports and the capability and the capacity that those strategic ports have. How do we do it in SDDC? Well, we have 5 brigades operating globally and 12 battalions that operate across the globe as well. So we have 3 brigades overseas, 1 in the UCOM AR, 1 in CENTCOM AR, 1 in PACOM AR, and 1 in the continental United States. 2 in the continental United States. And those brigades are responsible for almost every port, somehow or another, across the entire globe. They have some kind of responsibility. If it's not a physical responsibility, it's definitely a monitoring responsibility to ensure that we're distributing defense transportation cargo wherever it may go. The 12 battalions that sort of work for these brigades, they're spread out. We have 3 battalions, 2 on the East Coast, 1 in the Gulf, 2 on the West Coast. We have 3 battalions in the PACOM AR, 2 in UCOM AR, and 2 that's in the CENTCOM AR. And oh, by the way, we do have in a reserve battalion that's actively participating in the CENTCOM AR, which will push us up to about 13, and absolutely necessary because of some of the different operational issues that they're entertaining in the CENTCOM AR. So the first slide that I want to show you is, this is what we call the Army on the March. And what I want to lay out to you is this time frame is from May of 19 through April of 20. And it talks about 71 BCT or BCT minus moves. And you heard General Farman talk about 80 BCT minus moves a little bit earlier. What this does not account for is any of the CDREs, any of the exercises, nor does it account for any of the combatant command immediate requirements that they levy on SDDC to move a brigade or brigade size element, brigade minus size element at any given time. That rounds us up to about 80 BCTs that we move a year. Now, on the top two, you'll see the top two swim lanes on this particular slide. You'll see CTC movements. These are the NTC and JRTC movements, and those 8 levers that General Foreman talked about earlier has direct implications to these 8 levers in some way or fashion, but primarily it's rail and truck movements. So this is a CONUS move. The bottom 3 swim lanes are movements to combatant command AORs. And in moving those BCTs to combatant command AORs, every one of those 8 swim lanes are touched one way or another. And we'll talk a little bit further about that in a moment. So this particular slide here is our 8 readiness levers, and I'm going to highlight the one that's strategic ports. And as General Foreman indicated, this is our center of gravity. It is our key terrain. It is the place where we connect conveyances. Strategic ports, they receive rail lines. They have rail lines. They receive the rail from BCT movements from the force. They receive trucks. They receive containers. All of those different types of things are going to occur at a strategic port. And strategic ports, as SDDC works those strategic ports, we have battalions that are located at many of the strategic ports, but not all of them, but they have a responsibility. For example, in the Gulf Coast, we have 1 battalion that's located there, but we have about 4 strategic ports that we operate there. Beaumont, Corpus Christi, Port Arthur, as well as a Gulfport in Mississippi. So that battalion commander, he's responsible for all those ports, those strategic ports. Not only that, he's responsible for some way, somehow, he's responsible for every port that's there that's distributing defense transportation cargo. I talked about rail, but I'm not going to talk too much about it. But what I want you to understand, and the message that I want to carry out to you, is the role of strategic ports and the way that SDDC sort of looks at it. We look at it in terms of capacity and capability. You got to have capacity and you got to have capability in order to move BCTs. So when we're assessing those type of issues, those are the first things that we're looking at. Vessels. Obviously, we talked a little, you heard a little bit about that earlier today from General Foreman about vessels and MSC and their capability, what they bring to the table. And then I just spoke about highways and trucks. Ammo ports. We actually own in SDDC 2 ammo ports, but we operate at 3. Military Ocean Terminal, Sunny Point in North Carolina, and military, which is on the East Coast, by the way, and Military Ocean Terminal Concord, which is on the West Coast. And in the Northwest, we have Indian Island that we operate and move ammo through as well. Those ports are critical ports for the defense of this nation. Make no mistake about it, those ports are critical in moving ammunition. They have the capacity and the capability to move large amounts of ammunition to the warfighter, and we depend on them quite frequently. And in that slide that I showed you before, you don't even see the movement of ammunition on that slide. That just only showed you BCTs. But the amount of ammunition that we move through those ports are off the charts, and you would be surprised if we would have told you how much we would move. Containers, we move by containers, 40-foot containers. That's what the Department of Defense does. And we have an entire section in our staff that sort of manages containers, and we're going through a process right now to make sure we right-size our containers inventory along with some other agencies across the Army to include AMC and ASC. Total force integration, once you start hearing this term, let me explain to you just really quickly. This is our reserve component. We have a DSC, Deployment Support Command, which is a reserve command that falls under SDDC. They have port operating capability, and that port operating capability is what you would see at the port. You would see them, soldiers and units wearing SDDC patch, and that total force integration, you won't be able to tell the difference between an active duty or a reserve component SDDC surface warrior. You won't know the difference. So we put a lot of effort in ensuring that our reserve component is trained to standard and able to execute port operating tasks at the port at any given time. So those are the soldiers that you will see at the ports, and it's our responsibility to move units, DTS cargo through those ports, and this is the capability that we'll put at the ports to help ensure that we can execute that DTS movement. And lastly is our analysis and systems. As General Farman indicated earlier, we are responsible for doing analysis at strategic ports. So as I talked about capacity and capability a little bit earlier, our TEA, led by Mr. Bustler, his team goes out and do in-depth analysis to include storage capability, to include throughput capability, to include the depth of that seaport, deep water seaports, to ensure that if we got to move large units, heavy BCTs, that we can bring in the right type of vessel to move that BCT at any given time. And in many cases, that BCT is going to depart on an LMSR. And that LMSR is going to take about 3 to move 1 BCT, heavy BCT. And then we do that analysis and make sure we're setting up the right port for the right brigade that's going through. So General Farman also talked about port diversification. We're in the process now of, as we diversify these ports that we're using across the West Coast and the East Coast, what we're doing is taking a hard look at what is the best type of BCT to move through that particular port. In many cases, a lot of the ports have some of the capability and the capacity that we need, but from an operational standpoint, is the rail line near the pier so that we won't have to move tracks via trucks from one location to another, so that we can easily move a track from a rail to a vessel. Those are the type of things that we're taking a look at. Not that it's going to eliminate a port from being a strategic port, but it may require us to make an assessment whether that port is better used for wheeled vehicles such as a infantry or a striker brigade versus a heavy BCT. Or do we have enough capacity to move an aviation brigade through that particular port? And do we have the storage capacity for that aviation brigade? So this particular slide here is our strategic seaport usage. And the point here to this particular slide is, as I indicated to you earlier, our responsibility is to deploy units and move Defense Transportation System cargo, DTS cargo, which is the sustainment cargo. And in moving the sustainment cargo, just because if you're a strategic port, that doesn't mean that you're required to move all deployment cargo. You're required to execute deployments of military equipment. There are several ports that we have that do that, but they don't do it at the scale that you may see. For example, you may see Long Beach, a strategic port, but they do more in container movements than they do in deploying heavy units or BCTs. I just want to make this point pretty clear to you, because in many cases, we move containers a lot more than we move heavy units, but we also move containers through other ports too. So there is a requirement out there for us to sort of take a look at these ports and make sure that all the ports that's moving DTS cargo are meeting the right capacity and capability. That's all I have, and I look forward to the questions.
Thanks, Colonel. Mr. Fisher, Chris?
Thank you, Mr. Tokarski. Appreciate the opportunity to be on this panel with Kevin and Admiral Clarke and Colonel Evans, and thank everyone for putting this great conference together. We're very encouraged and excited about the level of interest in this conference, and I know we learn things from the strategic port standpoint every time we get together and discuss these things and how we can improve what we're doing for our national defense. Beaumont is, I represent the Port of Beaumont. We are one of those 17 strategic ports. And I know there is a number of very interesting panels that'll be coming up talking about the challenges of strategic ports and how we enhance it and working with them. So I'd just like to touch on the overall role and how we see it from the public port side of it, or a commercial strategic port. So our understanding is the role of the strategic port is to be prepared to provide all of the assets needed for bringing all modes of transportation together for the efficient and effective and safe deployment of military cargo in support of our national defense. And so how we go about that is what we're here to talk about today. And what ports do, we are the hub, and we bring all modes of transportation together. So certainly great to see representatives of shipping, rail, and truck here with us. So we bring these together. So the ports provide specialized ro-ro, general cargo wharves, docks, sheds, to handle the military cargo, secure berths, and enhanced security. And now cyber security is becoming an issue that we have to look at. Large cargo staging lots, so we have to have sufficient cargo capacity. It's very important to fulfill those needs for our military customers. Efficient rail interchange and loading and unloading tracks. I know Colonel Evans touched on that. That's one of the biggest things we have found over time, and our lessons learned after each significant move. There's always a choke point that we have to work on. We fine tune, and many of them have been improved over the years. Coordinating with rail, we found, is very, very important. How we interchange with the Class 1 railroads, that's very important, and I think we've made some strides there on improvements. Efficient highway and roadway connections, ports, and particularly in Texas, are getting even more aggressive on not just looking within their port, but outside the port, and how our main interstate and state highways connect into the ports. And we're working with the state of Texas and TxDOT on doing that, our ports in Texas, to improve that mode of transportation as well. We don't hire the labor and the stevedores directly. We provide the facilities for that, but we're very important as far as coordinating with them, because these are the entities that we work day to day with commercially. And so the more viable we can be commercially, the more of that labor asset and stevedore asset that we can have at our ports available to handle the military cargo. It's very important. And you'll hear this, I think, throughout, commercial versus strategic and how we balance it. And really that is one of the, probably that's going to be an overriding theme, because that's one of the things that strategic ports really have to look at. We do strategic ports regularly make large capital improvements in our ports. Port is being a port and harbor facility is a very capital intensive business. And so as we make these capital improvements, we look at not only our commercial needs, but we also try to take our strategic needs and the strategic needs of our military customers in consideration when we look at developing these type of cargo activities. We really, our military customers are a little different than our commercial customers. We set up contracts and we may have long-term public-private partnerships things like that. In Beaumont, we have had a long-term partnership. We do have the 842nd Transportation Battalion there in the port, and so we do treat it like that. But when you contractually, as we're working with our commercial customers, it has been different. And I know Mr. Tokarski mentioned that we're looking at maybe some new ways and trends where we can look at how we can establish that commitment and further it and enhance it so we can better provide what our military customers needs. So when we talk about challenges, and to touch on them just a little bit, space requirements, as we look at our space requirements in the port, make sure we have ample dock facilities, outside storage areas, some inside storage areas as well, to have these available when they're needed, because no one knows exactly when they'll be needed, and we try to maintain that capability as much as possible so we can be prepared not just for the standard military cargo moves, but the surges. And that's where this planning exercises and conferences like this are really so important. And continue to improve and manage our rail and highway infrastructure. And it's not just the physical infrastructure, but how we coordinate that with all modes of transportation. Sometimes what we've found when we do have these bottlenecks are different inefficiencies. There may be improvements made at DOD facilities, at the forts. We found years ago that the rail was a big was an issue at the forts, and so the forts did a fine job. They built up a lot of rail infrastructure, and then they tried to see how much they could load out, and it bottlenecks at the port. So these are very good things for us to look at and learn from. And one of course, our main tool and how we manage that, and working with Mayor Ad on our port planning orders, and what can we provide, and it gives everybody a good idea, and gives USTRANSCOM and SDDC a good idea of what we can provide. It's how we manage it day to day with our commercial activities. We still want to market those facilities commercially because that's what pays for them a lot of times. But we think that's a very good tool, and we're glad we're looking at that to see how we can improve on that tool. We never really want to get to the position in Beaumont where there has to be a priority order issued. We always want to plan and kind of treat our commercial business in a way that we're always planning for it like our strategic business, we plan for it like we do our commercial business. Because if you do have to have priority orders and come in and interrupt your commercial business, then your commercial customers then want to shy away from you in the future. Is that going to affect them? So we do try to manage it, and that's probably what you'll see as one of the main balancing acts that strategic ports try to accomplish to maintain their commercial viability while still ensuring that we can provide the strategic needs that our military customers require. And so with that, I'll certainly wrap up my comments. And
thanks, Chris. So at this point, we're going to turn into and asking some questions. There are a couple of microphones, or two, one in each aisle. So if you do have a question, I would ask that you speak at the mic. But before I turn, okay, Admiral Harris is lining up. All right, good. And I'd like to follow just on Chris's last comment point. So I've been to most of the strategic ports, and whenever I go to the strategic port as the NPRN chair hat on, I walk around and say, okay, I want to see the designated area that's the set-aside area, the staging area, the wharf and all that. And whenever I go there, what do I see? It's not empty. It's full. It's chock-a-block full. That's what the ports want. They want chock-a-block full of cargo and ships working. So on the Sealift side of it, I'm given 5 days notice to get one of my Sealift ships underway. Commercial ports given 48 hours to be able to clear and prepare for that. So Chris, I was wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit about how that actually happens and the coordination, the partnership aspects that you have, that all the ports have at really down on the dock to be able to make space and capacity available to meet that really short timeline and what it takes to make that whole thing work. Because I'm not sure that everybody understands that. And for myself, when I walked it and I learned about that, I was like, wow, this is important.
Well, thank you, Kevin. Yes, and in Beaumont, we have a little bit of an advantage that we do handle military cargo pretty regular, and so we can plan. It's a little easier for us to plan for that. But still, as we go out, like Kevin said, if we have a lot out there, we're getting ready to build a new $80 million general purpose cargo wharf. When we construct that wharf, we are building it with our military customers in mind. But after we build that, we're going to try to handle as much commercial business through it as we can, but it still will be an additional asset that'll be, that we'll put in our port planning order. But as we go out, and sometimes you're right, 48 hours, you know, we do say, yes, we can make these things available in 48 hours. If you have a whole lot full of wind energy or something like that, where you're going to move them to in 48 hours. But what we have tried to do is have other assets available that are comparable, that we can have coordination and still meet the requirements that are planned for. And so it is tricky, but it's really a good way that this is being set up, and some fine tuning is needed. But the commercial viability of these ports is really so important to the strategic needs, because the labor force is there. They know they're there ready to handle your cargo, move it through. The facilities are there, and the commercial, our commercial customers help pay for those facilities, and so they can be utilized. So it is a good mix on how it works. Balancing it is the challenge, and we kind of treat the military as a very important commercial customer with that added priority. That works with us because we handle enough of the cargo to be able to do that. If you're a strategic port and you don't handle as much cargo, then you have to manage it a little different way. And it's hard to have. It's always really good. What we used to say is, it's great if we could have some excess capacity. And you know, you'll still try to market it, but if you have some excess capacity there, you can at least provide that in your planning order and have more assurances that it'll be there and ready when needed.
Yeah, great, thank you. And I think it's important to note that at our various ports, and that you have many constituents as a landlord ports, and that many constituents that are part of this, that make this work, and that they help us with that. Admiral Harris.
Good morning, gentlemen. Great panel so far. And I don't want to turn this into a religious conversation, but whenever you start talking about climate change, you get people that have got very emotional and religious aspects and bring up to it. But it keeps coming up. And the question I have for y'all is, where does the impact of sea level rise? Where does the impact of greater numbers and more severe storms, you also know? Where does the impact of the warming, and we've seen each year it's warmer and warmer and warmer than the one before. Where does that threat impact, and what plans do you all have to mitigate that? One example, Norfolk. There's lots of concerns about the effect of sea level rise on the ability to move the fleet.
It's a great question, and I know for a number of us that we experienced Harvey and the impacts most pronounced in Beaumont, and both from an SDDC and the commercial industry. We had maritime security program ships that were loaded up, ready to go, and because of that, the river channel rise. Not able to get under the bridge. We had severe currents, not allowing the ships to flow there. So it's not fictitious. It's real. It's happened just as recently as 2 years ago. Gentlemen?
Well, let me jump on this one real quick. Hey, sir, it's good to see you again. I hadn't seen you since the Joint Staff Days. Last year, we had an issue at Matsu because of the hurricane that came through. And there was a flood that had grave impact on their ability to operate. As a matter of fact, it washed out a rail line. And Colonel Carlisle is the brigade commander. She's here today. And she'll talk about that a little bit more when she gets to her panel. But climate change does have an impact on deploying units, deploying DTS, Defense Transportation Cargo, and the distribution of cargo. There's a grave impact. That was just on the installation and the rail to move ammo into the installation. That doesn't even account for what's going on in the channel to get out to the ocean. So there are some future impacts that SDDC got to take into consideration that we hadn't fully thought out. And I'm pretty sure General Farman is writing that down, and he's going to tell us to go do it now. So we'll think our way through that issue, because we are planning for a hurricane season in the fall, and we do that effectively, but we haven't taken a look at the underlying issues associated with all of the infrastructural impacts across the board, and we'll start taking a look at that.
I guess I'll give it, to take it back to an earlier conversation, I will probably say the weather is the original contested environment, right? So we think about this all the time. We think about how we build in agility, flexibility, and resilience into our operations, into our strategic ports. That's why all of those strategic ports and the alternate ports are important, because we have to have the flexibility to divert from what, in accordance with the operational plan, is the preferred seaport to deploy the forces from. The day it's time to do it, there may be a hurricane coming, or there may be a catastrophic cyber attack. Doesn't matter what it is. We have to have that flexibility to divert forces in a different direction. We have to have the rail network that allows us to do that. We have to have the capacity and capability in all of the seaports in order to handle those, to give us that flexibility. That's the perspective we take it from. And I know our components spend a lot of time thinking about that. It's always in the forefront of military Sealift Command where the ships are in anticipation of having to move them out of harm's way. In this case, harm being the hurricane or the rising tide over the years, whatever the case may be, in order to not find ourselves in a condition where we are not ready to respond to time of need. Great question.
Sir, let me add another point there. I think that this forum is great to have this conversation because it really is about flexibility across the board in our organizations. When that hurricane came through and hit Matsu, we had to quickly go through a drill to figure out where we could have capability other places. So obviously the first thing was going out to the West Coast and then Indian Island. But there are some other capabilities on the East Coast, but it's just not as large as Matsu. So we had to develop a playbook on if that were to happen again. So for this forum, when we start talking about strategic ports, we have alternate ports as well. And if there's an impact on the East Coast, then that's going to cause us to move our operations elsewhere. And then if we do that, we may be operating several different ports in one closely knit area over a longer period of time. So that's the flexibility that we sort of need out of you in this forum. If we have to move from the East Coast to the Gulf Coast or from the West Coast to the East Coast or something of that nature, we need that flexibility, and we need for you to be in tune with that potentially happening. All right, that's
Great,
all I have.
thank you. Chris, anything to add on there? No,
Yeah, and whether it's global warming or not, these storms, you do have to. One thing I guess we can say in Beaumont that talk about resiliency. That's a key word. I think we have exhibited resiliency because we were hit by Rita, and that was a wind event. Ike was a storm surge event, and then Harvey was just a tropical storm when it got to us, but it was one hellacious rain event, and they were all different. I know our friends at Liberty Global had 2 or 3 ships in port there when Harvey got the channel. So swift from all the rain. So each storm that we found out, they're all different. I think each time we were kind of out till the channel cleared for about a week, but we were back up in operation and without any long-term adverse effect. I know Harvey caught us right in the middle of a very important exercise, and so I guess it was unfortunate that it happened then, but I guess it's good you learn some lessons and you see what can happen. So it's good to plan for as much as you can.
Right, and as Colonel Evans said, and Admiral Clarke alluded to, there is sufficient additional capacity, throughput capacity, and the planning and functions have looked at that extensively for that. With my Sealift hat on, I wish I could tell you I had other options and it had additional Sealift that we don't have. Captain Flumigan.
Hey.
Okay, so I'll jump on the first one. So this is about rail in the DTS system and precision rail in the DTS system. So one of the things that we deal with quite frequently is how do we sort of manage rail movements to make it as efficient as possible? Because in many of the cases, when we're dealing with rail, we're dealing with multiple companies because they got to switch rail lines from one company to another. In most cases, it's transparent, but sometimes it becomes problematic for us because if it occurs, sometimes we don't know until it's impactful to the unit that we're delivering that cargo to. So the way that I would sort of frame it is, for the industry, we recognize that there are going to be things that happen, things that go along, natural events that occur. As soon as they do occur, no matter how bad they are, as soon as they do occur, if you can tell us about it, we can get in front of the messaging associated with it. Currently, we have a move that's going out to NTC in which there was one of those type of issues that we're sort of late to the messaging. For us, it's about having the industry make sure that they're tied into our apparatus and make sure we're all communicating. We're working through those relationships as General Farman has indicated, and we're communicating and we know exactly what's going on at a given time. And then we can tell the customer what's going on. And in many cases, they understand. We just need to make sure we're working through that type of apparatus.
Well, you know, in the port industry, when business is bad, that's bad, and sometimes when business is good, that's bad, and that's what Houston's dealing with a little bit. You know, they've got a very vibrant, growing container business, but the energy sector, we all know, is really going crazy, and so that's such a busy channel, and there's so much going on there, and so that's a battle, not so much between a strategic need and a commercial need, but two commercial needs. The one that's coming out of that, and that is being addressed in the Texas State Legislature about size of vessels, and the one positive coming out of that, it really is in creating greater awareness at our state level, but hopefully on national level too, of the importance of improvements and infrastructure investment in our waterways. So we finally, after about 10 years, Port Arthur Beaumont, which is Sabine Neches Waterway, finally got approval for our deepening project from 40 feet to 48 feet. And make some other improvements for turning basins and straightening out the channel to improve the efficiency, because we also a very, very big energy port. And what Kevin mentioned, Beaumont is fifth, and Beaumont Port Arthur together is about the third largest channel in the U.S. by tonnage, but that's public and private sectors there, and a lot of that is petrochemical energy. But the value of that is that we do have it getting improvements to our channel, and maybe the economic awareness there, the economic benefits of those improvements will help us strategically as well. So our military vessels may not need the 48-foot depth, but if that increases the transportation efficiency of all the other commercial traffic, some of it needs it, then we'll benefit that from greater velocity of the vessels moving in and out of our strategic ports in Beaumont and Port Arthur on the Sabine-Neches waterway. So yeah, Houston's grappling with that from a commercial standpoint right now, but I think it'll create a lot of awareness of why we need channel improvements.
Thank you. Sir, question? You can introduce yourself and...
Right.
Yeah.
Good morning, gentlemen. Good morning, everyone. My name is Joel Rogers. I work for Gannett Plumbing, and I do the port simulations for SDDC TEA's port studies. This question is primarily for Colonel Evans, sir. I know there was talk a few years ago about the Army restructuring, going from the BCT environment, that mobile structure, back to possibly DISCOM-like structure that we had previously to fight a possible near-peer force. Do you, one, foresee that happening, us going to a different structure? And two, how does that affect the throughput at the ports? How does it affect how they receive equipment or the amounts of equipment that they would possibly receive? Thank you.
So to answer the second part of your question first, I think that'd be transparent. There would be no effect whether the structure changes or not, because it's still the same amount of equipment. The only thing that's going to change is where the equipment is going to go in terms of the organization. So to answer the first part of your question, there's always conversations about the Army changing its structure. I haven't seen anything that indicates that that is going to happen in the near future. As a matter of fact, for the Army, all the center of gravity is in Futures Command right now, so it's not in BCTs and restructuring BCTs. I hadn't seen any indication there. But the bottom line here is a BCT movement through a strategic port is going to bring the same amount of capability. Doesn't matter how that bad boy is structured, and it's going to be a lot of stuff, lots of stuff. Mm-hmm. Hopefully that answered your question.
Good.
Yep.
Thanks. If I could, question for Colonel Evans. So if I'm a port and I say, hey, I want to be a strategic port, I want to get in this as well. Mm-hmm. What's the decision-making process? And to be clear, the designation is by the commanding general SDDC for the designation of a strategic port. So what do you use for analyzing it and assessing it? How do you get to be one?
Yeah, to work through a strategic port, it's a very complicated process that I will tell you, I don't have all the details to, but what it starts with is an analysis through our TEA. It starts with an analysis going out to your port to make sure that you have the right capacity and capability for what we're trying to do. And firstly, we're going to focus on can you handle a heavy BCT that can go through that port? And what that means to us is, do you have the right storage capability to store lots of equipment? Do you have the right facilities to operate? Do you have maintenance facilities? Do you have the correct rail lines, or the amount of rail lines that we need to bring trains in order to execute that? Where are those rail lines going to end? Are they going to end at the port or somewhere other than the port where we got to drive heavy equipment to? All of those things are important. We're going to take a look at the pier. What's the capability of the pier? Can the pier handle multiple M1s or just one M1 at a time, or can't handle an M1? The worst thing that we can do is have an M1 go in the ocean on us trying to load a vessel. That's not a good thing. So there's a complicated process that our TEA goes through to provide that analysis of that particular port. And once TEA executes that analysis, they'll make a recommendation to Commanding General Farman on whether that should be a strategic port, and he is the decision maker on it.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you for that. For Admiral Clarke, question for you. We've heard now several commanders, TRANSCOM, and referring to the fourth component, industry partners and reliance on them. From a TRANSCOM perspective, what do you see as the some of the limitations today in a fourth component? We have representatives from all aspects of that, and what is TRANSCOM focused on and concerned about from a fourth component perspective?
Thanks for the question. It's a great question, and for those of you that aren't familiar with the term that our previous commander, General McDuke, coined, while General Lyons was the deputy commander, General Lyons has continued it, is referring to our industry partners as the fourth component to complement Air Mobility Command, Military Sealift Command, and SDDC. What that is intended to do is communicate that we value that relationship much more than just a transactional commercial relationship. Truly partners in helping us determine the best way to execute our mission, and recognizing that there is tremendous capacity and tremendous knowledge and understanding, not just of the modes that are used, but of the network that is necessary in order to, from end to end, deliver combat forces and sustainment capacity. What we concern ourselves most is the ability to reliably access that capacity in a contested environment. So we have spent, the command, U.S. Transportation Command, has spent considerable amount of time working with our commercial partners on ensuring that that the commercial partners have reliable command and control, and I'll get back to that in a second, of their capabilities, their capacities in a contested environment scenario. How robust are the cyber defenses? How hardened you are, but also how flexible your capabilities are. I talk about command and control from a military's perspective. That has a very clear definition, right? It's our ability to communicate, execute, and monitor the mission orders that are given. We are not given the same type of mission orders and need to have the same monitoring capability from the commercial partners, but we have to ensure that the commercial partners have the ability to communicate, to receive, and receive the orders that TRANSCOM issues, and to communicate to us when there are concerns. It was mentioned a little earlier that the steps that have been taken in strategic ports and in various aspects of commercial industry in support and working together with government is to ensure that the NIST standards are put in place. That's just the starting point. That is basic cyber hygiene, and our commercial partners have been very proactive in ensuring that they meet and typically exceed those requirements. I'm very comfortable that the majority of those partners understand the importance and understand the critical nature of those cyber defenses, not just for their ability to execute our military missions, but for their ability to execute their commercial viability, their business. If we can't rely on secure communications and our commercial partners being able to withstand cyber attacks that we expect will happen, then we will be at significant risk of being able to execute our mission in time of war.
Absolutely. Great. Thank you for that. General Whaley, sir.
Morning, gentlemen.
Morning.
A strategic question. Several decades ago, Congress mandated a strategic mobility study consistent with the existing national military strategy at the time. And if you're familiar with it, it's a very comprehensive and extensive study. It took months to do, but the end result was very comprehensive plans and guidance and capabilities, requirements, and shortfalls. Is there anything like that being considered at this point? And it also involved Maritime administration, et cetera, of federal agencies, not in the commercial sector. So my question is, anything like that being looked at?
Yeah, I'll start it, but I'm going to give a very, very brief answer, and then I'm going to phone a friend. The NDAA 18 or 17, sorry, did task a mobility capability requirement study. So that study has been conducted again as very current. That said, it was done under the, it was done assessing the current forces under the construct of the previous national defense strategy. At this, no, the answer is not no. We'll get to a little more detail. Over to you.
Friend, Bruce Buss, I'm the director of the analysis center at USTRANSCOM, also dual hat as the director of the Transportation Engineering Agency for the Army as well. And tomorrow there's a panel that we could talk about some of these, but the short answer is we've done 7 studies in the last 25 years. The last one we completed this year at the direction of Congress. Did that cooperation with OSD Cape. And it was directly addressed to talk about the rate car competition in the national defense strategy. The challenge we have is that the underlying demands that reflect the strategy are not fully formed. And so the Congress may give us an opportunity to do that again, but the short answer is we briefed this to the Congress this year. The capacity that we have is adequate to meet the national defense strategy with the caveat that we're at elevated risk. And again, I could go into a lot more detail in a classified environment, but I will stop at that point right now. Just simply say that the capacity we have as a nation, both with the capital assets, airlift, sealift, area fueling primarily, and all the capabilities that go with that. The port capabilities for the Indian movement forces is adequate with elevated risk in some areas. And the greatest change that we saw is the nature of how these adversaries will contest us end to end. And the nature of the great power competition is that they will do this conspicuously because they do not want to fight the United States of America on their own soil. So the changing nature of this environment, I know that General Brodman will talk about this at lunch today as well, is that this is a game changer for how you think about how we as a nation will project forces in the future. We will not be able to do it with impunity. We've already talked about the areas we'll be contested. So how we integrate that into mobility study was probably the biggest difference between what I call a log map of just moving mountains to doing that toward challenge and snipping away. So I can go into detail maybe tomorrow during my panel, but if you want to talk about offline, I can maybe give you some more insights. But just to say, we have completed the major mobility study directed by the Congress. Likelihood of us getting a chance to do that again in the near future is probably high.
And if I could just add a comment to Bruce and the Admiral's points, and maybe it's a personal observation, but I think that the one aspect that maybe these studies tend to look at different aspects and to see it all meshed together. And when we talk about a defense transportation system at large, I think the congressional leadership needs to understand about how the various components fit together. We look at Sealift requirements, well, we didn't look at all, there may be aspects to that maybe weren't there, pieces and components, but we need to pull it all together, and I think to be able to really present the nation's leadership where some of these challenges may lie. Other comments to that? Okay. And we're getting closer. I just want to finish with one comment, and if I might, and it's a little bit following on Admiral Clarke's, the question that I had for him about the fourth component. And with that is a labor component. And labor is instrumental for all that we do whenever it comes to transportation. I was at the Transportation Advisory Board meeting that Admiral Brown, the NDTA, chaired last week. And Labor is clearly something that cuts across all of the transport modes, and a challenge point for this nation today is attracting youth into these career fields, whether it's to be a truck driver, a sailor, a pilot, retention issues and concerns with that. And I'm glad that at this session we do have a labor, the longshoremen represented here for this, because they do provide a key instrument to that. And it wasn't that long ago that we actually had an agreement with the Pacific Maritime Association to actually work and train longshoremen on government sealift ships. And they need to understand how to drive those big tanks and the equipment to be able to do that, how to load 45-year-old ships that still have booms on them that they haven't seen and that they're experienced with commercially. And so that's an aspect that I think would like to be brought out a little bit, is what we can do more in terms of the workforce preparedness and that as well. My agency has a number of things going on right now with domestic centers of maritime excellence, and I will tell you there's a lot of schools out there that are teaching these vocational schools to be, and the ports, the transportation companies are partnering together with schools to be able to attract youth into these career field areas, and that ports are one of those aspects in that as well. And that's something I think that we would definitely don't want to lose track of, is that we've got to get people moving into this industry as well, because they're going to be the ones that are going to drive this forward and drive this nation forward when it comes time for war. With that, I'd like to thank my distinguished panel members. So if you give them a round of applause for the excellent job.
And thank you, Kevin. Thank you all. You're dismissed. But I do want to follow up on one of the questions I thought was pretty good, and I don't know the answer to it. That's why I want to follow up. I'm looking at Don Jones. There was a question about precision rail scheduling. I don't know if I have the term right, but it's a change in the way rail is going to be operating, and I don't know how far it's going to permeate throughout the rail companies and whatnot. But Don, my question is there going to be a readiness impact in your opinion? And if you could describe that, I'd appreciate it.
Thanks. Phone a friend, huh? Precision scheduled railroading, it was a theory practice pioneered by Hunter Harrison, deceased. He was very successful with it at several railroads. It has made its way through the highway of Wall Street to the rail industry. Primarily, I think we've got a pretty good handle on it. It will increase capacity. It will increase train speed. At Norfolk Southern specifically, our train speeds increased about 14–15% in the last year. So it will allow the trains to move more quickly. It will allow that in conjunction with positive train control, which is another major aspect, a congressional mandate that all trains would basically have to have a remote control operation. Should there be operator error, the train could be stopped at the dispatch. So the combination of the two coming together is really increasing capacity. It's allowing us to move more trains more quickly, running trains closer together with greater precision on the trains itself. The biggest impact I see on the daily rail calls, a lot of things change fairly rapidly in terms of when the train is releasing, when it's loading. What that effect with precision scheduled railroading is, we're asking for 3-day notice for power and for crews and engines to pull these trains. And we don't have the excess manpower kind of sitting idle saying, I wonder if I get a train today on the payroll. So the only impact I really see is that a little more advanced notice, and we will deliver your trains more quickly and with a tighter scheduling for when you'll receive them. Hope that answers the question.
Yeah, it does. So it just points out that more planning needed because of a industry change that's going through the industry right now. So to me, I listen to this and it makes me concerned about the security of our supply chain writ large. I'd like to continue that discussion this afternoon or later this morning. We've got another panel coming up. We're going to take a break.